Hello, everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. Excited to bring you a really interesting discussion around risk. And we have two special guests. First, we have Ed Gaudet. He's CEO and founder at Censinet, and Karl West, former CISO at Intermountain. Welcome, Karl. Welcome, Ed.
Glad
Thank
to
you,
be here.
John. It is an honor to join.
Yeah, so this should be a really fun discussion. I think, it's interesting. Censinet just issued their, what was it? I think it was called your risk manifesto, which
Oh,
I
did
think
you read that, John?
out. Yeah. I mean,
Oh,
really
cool.
impressive. It's a
Oh, wow.
fascinating look at it, and
Oh,
we'll definitely link to it in the article when
oh,
we.
great. Yeah,
But
I had some fun with that one weekend. I had all this information about risk ops in my head, and I leveraged the manifesto format to kind of pull it all together.
yeah.
So
It's so
glad you liked it.
beautiful. I mean, people are gonna love it, and so
Okay,
we'll link to it so everyone could go check it out, and
great.
some nice Easter eggs I think in it as well. But before we dive into risk, Ed, how about you tell us a little about yourself and
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, John. So I'm Ed Gaudet. I'm the CEO founder of Censinet. Started the company back in 2017. Spent about 8 years at another healthcare IT company called Imprivata,
Uh-huh.
and helping health systems with their workflows, their identity and access management, their e-prescribing. And I kept running into this problem, on a regular basis, these having to deal with these risk assessments, security assessments coming in. If you saw one, you saw one. That was the sort of the joke. We always tried to get leverage. We always tried to create some type of system that would allow us to get better velocity, but we just couldn't do it. And so that always stuck in the back of my mind when I started Censinet was, boy, I wish I could, or someone out there could solve that problem for not only for providers, but for vendors as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's amazing what you all have done in this regard. Well, anyway, we'll dive into the product later, but I just love that, a lot of people would look at it and say, let's just do HIPAA risk assessment. You've taken it way beyond that, which I think is
Mm.
what's really interesting. But before we dive in there, Karl, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
You bet. Karl West, former Chief Information Security Officer at Intermountain Healthcare, where I spent 24 years in a variety of IT and other kinds of roles, everything from EDW, data analytics, operations. Last 4 years, I worked on the President's Council doing strategy. So great opportunity to understand where is healthcare going, what is it doing, and through all of that, cybersecurity was in my portfolio. I was the CISO for 8 years at Intermountain Healthcare and loved that, and really the whole heart of our talk today, John.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that, Karl, and maybe you could start and share, why does risk matter in a healthcare organization, and how should healthcare organizations really be looking at risk?
I think a great question, John. And why does risk matter? Well, first, healthcare is the industry that is under the most attack, and it just needs to matter because it comes to patient safety, it comes to reputation, it affects everything that we do, and that patient safety is of course at the heart of cybersecurity. It's the availability piece. It also affects the integrity piece
Hmm.
associated with the data. And I think that's why it matters to healthcare, and we need to be paying more attention. As I look across healthcare, uh, when you ask why does it matter, it probably matters most because we're not doing as much as we could, as much as we
Hmm.
should, and we need to do better.
So ignorance is not bliss, is what you're saying.
In fact, it's what's causing many of the issues that are occurring, those breaches, those fish attacks. Ignorance doesn't lead to a happy place.
Yeah. Ed, what would you add to it? And I think it's also interesting because some people are like, well, if I just don't address it, right, I don't take risky behavior. Well, I mean, inaction is a risk as well, I think,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But
that's right. That's right. Well, look, 10 years ago, things were much more manageable. Most of our vendors and our applications and our devices were, behind the four walls and in the data center and managed directly by the IT staff. And now everything is pushed to third-party vendors. And so you've got a larger attack surface that's outside of your control. You compound that with the fact that the attackers have gotten much more sophisticated. And so again, the past 5 years, it was all about loss of data. And while that's inconvenient and while that can cost the health system fines and corrective action plans and things that they may have to do in order to remediate those risk that and those findings that maybe the ONC or the OCR catches. What now is happening is care is being disrupted through ransomware. Clinics are shutting down because they can't pay the ransomware. And so the stakes are much greater than they were, say, just 5 years ago. And most importantly, and this is really what hits it home for me, is if your mother, your brother, your sister, your father's hooked up to a medical device, and now that gets attacked, that's a life. That's someone that's close to you that could potentially be harmed or die. And so it's a much more personal impact than I think it was just 5 years ago. So the stakes are much higher. The attack surface is greater. It's exponential. It's geometric, and the attackers are much more sophisticated than they were even just 5 years ago. We don't see this problem going away. We just see it getting worse. And so as an industry, we really have to come together and think much differently about the problem space. We have to, sort of push on the old assumptions that we made about things like doing annual assessments. For example, risk needs to be continuously monitored. It can't just be a, set it and forget it exercise. And so that's really what is at the heart of risk ops.
And John, just to add to what Ed said, a great lead into this whole conversation about risk. And if you, coming back to your question, why does risk matter? Leaders inside healthcare who are listening today, I would share with you really 4 options. And one of those 4 is not to do nothing, but you can transfer risk. That's what we'll talk a little bit about here today, and what Censinet can help us with, the transferal of risk. You can avoid risk. You can mitigate risk. You can choose to accept risk. That's what we've got to be able to do, is put plans together and say, I'm going to accept this risk. It's a level of risk I can tolerate. I'm going to mitigate it. I'm going to transfer it. I'm going to do things to avoid it. But the idea that no action, that's not an acceptable posture as we look at risk. And I think if anything could come across in this, recognizing there are good solutions out there, partners like a Censinet who can help us with the transferal, where we get into trouble and think, oh, I just shifted it, now I have to do nothing. That again is a problem. So I think we've got to take appropriate actions and recognize as leaders in healthcare, no action is not an acceptable course.
Well, that's a great framework, Karl. And I think it's fascinating to think through. And is that the reality today for most organizations, is that it's not that everything should be transferal or everything should be, I'm accepting risk, that there must be, is that ideal to have some of each of those and at least to be thoughtful and deliberate in that? And, is that where organizations are managing risk improperly? Is they're not spending the time to think about it? Is that how you think about it, Ed? Or what do you see organizations doing that, to manage this properly or not?
Well, first of all, it's a big problem. And I think part of the thing, what we're learning as we go and engage with health systems like Intermountain and Partners Healthcare, MGB and others, we find that IT risk, third-party risk, is just really the tip of the spear. It's the tip of the iceberg, if you will.
Yeah.
It's sort of our entry point in. And then when we work with our customers, we identify all these other silos of risk that exist and that are taking up resources in the system. And if there was a way that we could actually consolidate those workflows, if we could actually begin to pull the data into one area and start to share and leverage the data across the organization. Think about cybersecurity. Most of the health systems treat it as a vertical slice, when in fact it's horizontal. It cuts across every aspect of the business, every aspect of care. And really this move to integrate cybersecurity at the enterprise level with enterprise risk is where people should be going and where they should be taking, their overall program and strategy for risk.
What other areas does it affect beyond cybersecurity? Or, is it just all of that contracting that there? I mean, to me, there's a lot of risk in the contracting process.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, we have so many more third parties. I often say a CIO is a vendor manager. That's their job, people and vendors, right? So is that what you see is those risks in those contracts, or what other areas?
Yeah, there's research risk. So there's a process called institutional review board, where they're partnering with an academic medical center and maybe a pharmaceutical company and the provider to do some type of research study that has to be assessed. And often, there's several hundred of those assessments that exist in these larger systems.
Right.
That's one silo and aspect of it. IT risk tends to be technically focused on those providers of solution providers of things like clinical software and cloud software and medical devices and IoT devices. And that typically gets assessed at the point of purchase and managed. And so, the mindset of just doing it, like I said, setting it and forgetting it, and maybe doing an annual reassessment has to change. We have to take much more of a life cycle approach to risk at the point of purchase. When we implement and configure it, maybe the scope changes, so the risk may change. The residual risk may be different than the inherent risk when we first took it out of the box. When it actually gets used, so the user community may actually change the scope, which again changes the risk. If we look at what happened with Blackbaud as an example, that was a donor application that was recently breached. A lot of health systems were relying on that to manage their donor population. And so you could put PHI in the application. There was an area that was secure, but in fact, what typically was happening was people weren't thinking about using it for PHI. They may have said, well, it's really a medium or a low risk, right? They artificially stratify risk into buckets because they don't have resources to assess everybody. They're not automated. They're only using spreadsheets and phone calls and emails, right? So they have to do something to, again, manage that volume of risk appropriately. So Blackbaud kind of gets pushed over to the side. And then they realize, wow, users actually were inputting PHI into the system and they weren't even doing it safely. They were doing it in other areas of the application. And so that's just one example of why it's really important to take that life cycle view. What happens when that vendor updates the application? That could change the scope of risk. What happens when they patch it, et cetera, all the way through termination of the vendor. The vendor's got your data in the cloud. You have to ensure and validate and verify that that data has been removed, right? So that's a potential risk as well. So that taking that life cycle approach to risk is really important. But those are technical suppliers. If you think about the non-technical suppliers, PPE providers, your laundry service, right? So for some large health systems, if their laundry service provider has an incident or is affected in some way, that could affect their ability to deliver care. Can't get the gowns, can't get the equipment, can't get the sheets, et cetera.
Wow. That's interesting to think about, especially in COVID. We all learned about the importance of that supply chain. Karl, what would you add? And maybe let's expand the discussion and talk about what were some of the biggest challenges to managing risk in a healthcare organization?
Yeah, I think the path, John, that Ed went down is very important for us to consider. Every aspect, every venue inside the organization becomes a challenge for cyber risk. And as we take a look at food services, we all are aware of a large breach that occurred in healthcare through a food services channel, through medical device, through IoT, every aspect. If we look at what's happening with healthcare and the cost challenges that we're facing, those are places where cyber has to become involved. Merger and acquisition. As we look at that and think, is merger and acquisition a good place to not have cybersecurity? Because literally, I look at it like and share with people, it's a little bit like COVID. We understand that when two people come together, we've got to have a mask, we've got to have hand sanitization, but we bring together two businesses and we forget we've got to have those same type of protective devices in place and controls, policies, and procedures. And if we just stand up these two organizations and don't take the time to do a proper assessment of that organization, then we see in 2020, John, I saw an organization that had 9 partner breaches.
Wow.
Breaches now, those are things that are affecting things like supply chain. It may affect IT. It may affect billing. It may affect delivery of imaging services. And I tracked this one organization and thought, oh, and by itself, one organization I watched had 9 breaches themselves, 5 breaches themselves, excuse me. And those are the kinds of things that we've got to be paying attention to this risk and recognize that when a partner who provides to us clinical services goes down, that affects the delivery of care inside a healthcare organization. Now it becomes back to our top of conversation. Why should we care? Now it affects the delivery of care, the ability of us to provide services that will maintain health, well-being of a patient who just came with a critical clinical issue to us.
Mhm.
Yeah. Great way to frame it.
Yeah, and we're really in the first inning of this journey, believe it or not. There's such a big problem. Part of the, the initial focus for Censinet early on was the productivity and the economics of managing risk, just that slice of IT risk,
Yeah.
were just off the charts. There were too many vendors to manage. There was too much data to collect, and there were not enough people. If you had a couple of resources dedicated, that was great. But if they moved on, if they left the organization, it was really hard to replace them. If you wanted to redeploy them into other areas that were, providing greater value to the IT organization or the organization at large, you didn't have that flexibility because everything was done manually. And so organizations really need to think through their automation strategies. How are they going to leverage tool sets like Censinet? And there's a bunch of other tools out there as well. But how are they going to leverage those tools to really drive that strategy that's going to not only enable them to do things faster, quicker, more accurately with what they have today, but then really expand into those other areas and move risk from a data analysis exercise, if you will, to much more actionable. If I have a problem, I should want to be able to fix that problem immediately, remediate that problem, transfer that risk, as Karl said earlier, right? And so that connecting and integration of risk with operations is really a step forward in this industry. We don't know anyone out there that's talking about it like this, but this is where the industry has to move in order for us to move forward. And when I talk about moving forward, I don't talk about one health system moving forward. I talk about what if we could actually move the needle on data breaches, patient safety, and care disruption collectively and collaboratively as an industry? What would that look like? And that's what Censinet's vision and mission is all about. It's building that network of providers and their suppliers to basically create a way to quickly manage and remediate and identify, and then eventually take those incidents and vulnerabilities through to completion and close.
That's an ambitious vision you have there. So I like it. I like where it's headed. Now let's talk about your product a bit. I mean, you have something called RiskOps, which, I think most of us in the IT world are familiar with IT DevOps and some different things that, I love that you're queuing off that. How would you define RiskOps and how does that work in the Censinet product? And then maybe even one step further, isn't a bunch of spreadsheets and meetings enough, or how is it different than I think that's the standard, right? That's who you're competing against in many ways, is a bunch of spreadsheets and meetings and committees, right?
That's right. Well, those tend to be one-to-one interactions, so it's really difficult to get to the place I talked about earlier with a one-to-one interaction, right? If Intermountain is kind of doing their own thing, and Partners is doing their own thing, and Cedars is doing their own thing, they're spending a lot of time repeating the same steps to assess and to manage that risk. What we really want to do is take that and create a network where we can leverage the data and we can share the data and we can eliminate the cross work and the repeatability and duplication of work, right? So we take all of that extra time and extra resources out. And as we're collecting data based on what the network provides, but also what the individual health systems collect on their own, based on their own profile and based on their implementation, we know which will be different from others, right? We get a really interesting view of risk across an ecosystem that includes those third parties and eventually fourth parties. And so being able to not only collect the data in one place, the next piece is to connect that data with those actionable insights, right? And give the health system, give the CISO, the CIO, the ability, and their teams of risk analysts, right, to do all the work, the heavy lifting. Give them the ability to answer the question of the day or of the hour. Who are my riskiest vendors? Which vendors have PHI but don't have a BAA signed, right? Being able to answer those types of questions is really, really important. Actually getting a complete view and inventory of all of your third parties and all of the areas of risk, whether it be in research, whether it be in IT, whether it be in the supply chain area, it just doesn't exist today.
Yeah.
It's in all these data silos. It might be in contracts, it might be in legal, it might be in HR, it might be in the HR system, right? And so consolidating that and bringing it together and then integrating it with other systems that are being used by IT, like a ServiceNow for IT operations, right? Like a GRC application that might be used for reporting tools, like an RSA Archer, right? That all is important as well. So that's how we view it. It's for us, it's much more of a platform view of the world, and we can't do everything. We acknowledge that, so we have to work with other service providers that are entrenched in being used in the health system today for other areas of work, like IT operations or
Sure.
GRC, or maybe even maybe even an IRB application that does maybe the front end of the process but doesn't do the assessment piece, right?
Gotcha.
John, if I took what Ed just said, which is the product from Censinet, and then I said, what does it look like inside an organization, a healthcare organization? What is it we're doing, and how could we take advantage of what we just said? First off, every organization is, as you said, collecting spreadsheets, holding meetings, trying to assess risk. We collect and try to understand the data, and certainly Censinet provides an excellent source of shared data. But in the end, what I have to do is I have to, inside an organization, I have to create an engineering piece where I understand, here's the product I'm purchasing, here's the product that's been deployed, here's what we developed, and how do I protect that? And what that really boils down to is, as a CISO, I need to be able to translate everything we're doing into appropriate HIPAA regulatory policy and controls, and at the same time have that aligned with the business strategy. And it has to result in actionable data. So really what I've got to be doing is up front, prior to purchase, prior to development, I've got to have people sitting, looking, monitoring everything we do and how we're doing it, where it's in the cloud, where it's in our data center, get controls built, engineer all of that. And so really the idea becomes, can we not leverage something? And good organizations have been doing this for a while. In 2015, President Obama announced the Cyber Information Sharing Act. And what that meant to a number of us as CISOs was, why don't I just start calling my friends and saying, how did you do it? What did you do? And how do I leverage? And what Ed brings to a table for us is the opportunity for us to put together some information under the Cyber Information Sharing Act, where we take a look and say, how do I now take advantage and leverage of shared information? And the bad actors are sharing, and if we don't realize it, we're way behind on the game, and we need to be sharing. And what we need to be sharing is all of this information about threat and vulnerability, and how do I keep up? For me, what it meant at Intermountain was I had 20, 30 resources dedicated to this function we're talking about, of upfront, before a purchase, during development, tracking, looking at what weaknesses exist, what vulnerabilities in the app, how do I control, how do I mitigate, how do I transfer the risk? I've got to do something with it. And then after I bought a product, maybe I bought it from someone else. Now I've got a partner. Now what I've got to do is be tracking, what are they doing? Are they managing it as well as I thought they would? Did they do what they said they would? Again, those all become opportunities for us to then leverage, take that number of 20 or 30 people down to 1 or 2 or 5, or depending on your organization. If I could leverage what other healthcares are doing, and by the way, many of us pre-Censinet began to do this. We would sit together and say, how did you manage this particular product, this risk
Mm-hmm.
vendor? We began to share those things. And really the idea for us all became, I need to have a vendor risk inventory. I need to list from 1 to 5,000, 1 to 4,000, depending on how many you have, every vendor. What is the risk? How am I managing it? Who's responsible? And oh, by the way, how compliant are they with what they're saying they would do? That's where we began to look at Ed and what his product brought to the table. And I said, I can reduce significantly the overhead for my risk management as I partner with people who can bring me appropriate pieces of information to share with me ongoing, what's happening, what breaches are occurring, what's the threat level at a partner that I just don't have. I can't throw enough bodies at it.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting the power of just a structured approach to risk, right? I mean, that's what this feels like to me. And like Carl said, I imagine many organizations had a structured approach and were doing it somewhat effectively with spreadsheets and meetings because they had the structure. But I find it fascinating the sharing between organizations because the problem of securing an IT system at Intermountain is similar to Dell Medical School in Austin, right? Like those two, it's not dramatically different, what's needed, but there is also, I think, some concern about sharing between, let's be honest, with telehealth, we're now all competing organizations to some extent, right? So how does that work? I mean, is there a lot of sharing? And that's hey, it's like security doesn't matter. We're not competing on that, so let's share best practices in security. Is that what you see, or do you see some kind of nervous competing principles? Like I don't really want to share with them. What are you seeing, Ed?
Yeah, there's a couple of different dynamics. So we built a two-sided network first and foremost. I mean, again, we worked with Carl and we worked with others in the industry to really help us think through the design of the system and what they had seen in the past that didn't work, what they may have been building on their own or tried to build on their own at one point, right? So we took all that, that experience and knowledge when we began building out Censinet. What we learned quickly was that we needed a way to create leverage across a network, and obviously there's plenty of examples. You look at Amazon and retail, you look at some of the car manufacturer, the car websites, right, where they're leveraging the two-sided network. Nowadays, everyone has some type of two-sided network or multi-sided network. Yeah, and I thought, wow, if we could apply that here, what would that look like? And the other dimension of this is that the vendors, and I was a vendor too, so I could bring that vendor perspective. Vendors want to do the right thing mostly. There's an occasion where the vendor may be pushing a little bit the truth, right, to get a deal done. But I think ultimately vendors really want to be enabled to do the right thing. And the spreadsheet process doesn't allow that. It doesn't enable that full transparency. And it also puts enormous amount of pressure on the vendors to deal with these one-offs, right? They never get repeatability. You never get the ability to actually, again, get leverage in a process. And
it almost allows the vendor to avoid, I think, because
that's right.
Don't know the questions asked. They didn't ask, so we're not going to share, right?
That's right. And so on the vendor side of the network, they do it one time. They do it one time for their organization, and then they can add as many products and services that they provide into the platform. And we have easy ways for them to duplicate and their assessments and things, so they don't have to spend a lot of time recreating the wheel if they have like products. But the point is, once it's done, the vendor then can work with the provider. Now the vendor controls their information. They can share it with the provider. The provider then could assess it, analyze it, create their final assessment, which could include remediation actions that the vendor has to take. And then they coordinate those and schedule those. It's all in one place. I remember as a vendor, I may get some remediations that were printed out in a PDF or stuck at the end of a contract, and people forgot about them, right? The system allows you to manage that full transparency of remediations. Once they get completed, the vendor can go back then and update their assessment. Anyone connected with that vendor gets those updates automatically in the form of notifications. So it's a
Nice.
really nice way to get leverage and repeatability and sharing of that data. On the provider side, we have a collaborative where we have regular meetings with our providers, and we're figuring out a way where we can take some internal aspects of the data that the providers collect and enable them to share it with other providers as well. Today, it's kind of done out of band, but we're working on ways for them to share those learnings and best practices. We also have a number of best practices that we codified in the platform that we share with all the providers. And as we interact with providers and we learn things, we bake those back into the best practices and then share them back out to the network.
Yeah.
So, we're constantly, think of the network as this organism, we're constantly feeding it with better ways to do things and more data. And again, more workflows as we learn about these other silos of risk that occur in the health system.
Interesting. Karl, I can see you're itching to share.
That went a great way, but I do, to your question, John, believe that healthcare should never be competing on cyber. And I try to advocate that as much as I can. This is not a place we can compete, and it is a place where we can benefit if we'll come together. And I have advocated that for years. Oftentimes in a meeting where I'm presenting, I'll advocate and I see all heads nod. And then I say, by show of hands, how many of you share data with me? And it's almost like asking someone to pull their pants down. I see a lot of impressed looks. But I think it's changing. And with Obama and the Cyber Information Sharing Act, I see much more of it. And
Yeah.
for the past 4 or 5 years, I have spent large amounts of my time meeting with large groups of CISOs, sharing threat and vulnerability information. So the idea of not competing here and of sharing best practices is critical to our being able to defeat the bad actors. Then when we come together, we all recognize we have a different set of risk and a different set of threats. And that's based on business choices. A business makes a decision about product, about people, about process. There will be commonalities that I could leverage as service from Ed and say, this will help me to understand the risk associated with partner X or partner Y. It will also help me to understand their compliance, my application. The way that I'm managing risk inside an organization will depend entirely on the level of controls and the amount of mitigation, transfer of risk that I have to do, which may be different than someone else's. But if we take a look at overall principles, fairly same. I have to have all healthcares, they need to have a risk inventory. The risk inventory needs to be not a Google inventory. It has to be, when we look at risk, it has to be the specific risk based on the posture, the tolerance, the controls, the policies that we set in our organization. That's our risk inventory. And once I have that, I need an inventory of every partner from 1 to 2,000. And I need to know some information that somebody could share with me and save me a lot of time. How would I rate these critical, high, moderate, or low? Where are their weaknesses in their controls, which I need to now mitigate? You can't just transfer this risk and say, I've handed it over to vendor X. You have to, a regulatory requirement, and you have to be monitoring your vendor risk inventory. That's what's going to prevent the third-party breaches that are occurring so much more frequently. It started out, it was healthcare's, now it's third parties, and those third parties are affecting us. We've got to have a good inventory of our third-party risk we can rely on and leverage sharing again here. And at the heart of all that is understanding our data inventory. Now, where is the data and who has the ball? Am I accountable or is the partner accountable?
Right.
We have language and controls guided by instruments that Ed and his team can provide us so we know where it's at, who's accountable, what controls apply, and are they consistently, compliantly adhering to things, or is there evidence that would be shared by any of us that, oh, by the way, this particular partner isn't holding our data in the highest levels of control. So that's where I see some great value in this, making sure that we have that information, making sure controls are being applied, then we're all better. And I don't view that as a punitive thing against a healthcare organization or their partner. I actually view it just as good partnership so that we're all holding each other accountable and we're all meeting similar levels of control and management of risk.
Right. Yeah, and I always say, John, you're going to eventually share it. You're going to share it when there's a vulnerability or an incident.
Uh-huh.
Wouldn't you rather share it at the front end to actually have a chance of mitigating the vulnerability or incident, right? So
Yeah.
this notion of not sharing it, I think, is starting to change. And like with any disruptive technology, it takes time for the industry and folks to absorb it, right? So there's always that initial pushback.
Sure.
It's new. We don't understand it. Why are we doing it? We're good with these spreadsheets. But we're seeing more and more aspects of healthcare realize that there's power in sharing. And so as an example, we actually are working with Class Research. They become a partner. We signed a strategic deal at the end of the year to extend the class ratings, which are ratings for performance, of vendor performance, to include cyber preparedness ratings.
Interesting.
And so that's a really a really nice way for a partner to extend a service and an offering that they have, but also provide a service to the community. Now all of the class research providers and vendor partners can get access to those prepared ratings, which are based on the data that we collect through those assessments. We don't share all the data, we share a certain slice of it, but it does gives a provider and also the vendor an indication of their maturity. How mature are they in data protection or network security or resiliency, right? So it's a really good initial view of the particular vendor or product that the provider may work with.
There's so much sense in the healthcare industry because when we go to buy a product, the chief medical officer needs to know, does this meet the need? So they turn to class who tells them, here's how it does this function, here's how it does this, here's how it integrates back into your EMR. And then after they buy it, then my team has to go out and do an assessment of the risk. Now, if Ed could provide me right now while the CMO or the CNO is looking at that, if you could provide me a red, yellow, green dashboard to say higher risk, lower risk, boy, it just makes sense because otherwise I have to do it afterwards and then surprise the CMO and say, yes, you picked an awesome product from class, aware of the risk. And now I've got to take the candy away from the CMO and say, no, that won't work. It's just, again, another partnering opportunity. I really like what Ed and class have done in this partnership. It saves me a lot of grief and it puts it all together right at acquisition time. We're going through supply chain. Everyone can see right up front, here's what it looks like.
Right. And if they want more data and they want more information, they can leverage the Censinet platform to actually dig into those assessments and again, partner with the vendor to get more responses, more evidence and documentation, pen tests, SOC 2 reports, data flow diagrams, etc. That's all part of that process.
Yeah. I find this whole process pretty fascinating. It's interesting. You talk about, I mentioned ignorance is bliss, right? Which ignorance doesn't really happen. It's really denial, right? And it's probably shame around the fact that you haven't done what you need to do to assess this risk, right? And it's interesting. I didn't think I'd talk about Brene Brown in a risk ops discussion, but she talks about this a lot in our own personal lives, right? And I think we go through it the same in this type of risk situation, and that sharing we shouldn't be shamed by sharing, right? But we actually, by doing that, by being vulnerable, as she says,
Mm-hmm.
we actually feel better about ourselves because everyone else will say, oh yeah, we're dealing with that too. And
Yeah.
here's what we did. And it makes you more powerful. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating how the corollaries between this idea of sharing versus hiding your weaknesses
Right.
actually
Yeah.
is more shameful to a person than sharing. So fascinating. Um, let's finish it off. Let's have both of you kind of reply. I'd love to hear. I can't wait to hear the answer to this one. But what do you think the number one risk is to healthcare organizations, and in say the next 2 years? Maybe Karl, you could start, and then Ed. What's that number one risk that healthcare organizations should be watching for?
Yeah, and John, when I look at this, I'm always a little anxious about Google Answers, and
Uh-huh.
if I go visit with the healthcare and the risk assessment they have looks like something I could have found on Google,
Uh,
it isn't a good risk assessment. I think the most important thing an organization can do is understand its real risk. What is the real risk based on their strategy, based on their posture, their tolerance for risk? What is their real risk? I think for us all generically, and I'm going to try to stay away from a generic answer, but for us all in healthcare, the no matter what we have done, no matter the level of preparedness or the lack of preparedness, we're all facing um, basics 101. Threat management and threat and vulnerability are not the same thing. Threat detection and management and vulnerability basics and patching to prevent us against those kinds of things. That's very, very critical. And it happens over in the partner side. And what it translates into in healthcare is a staggering amount of fishes that are getting through that should have been caught through some patching, some patch management, some threat detection that didn't occur. And then we have breach that's occurring. And I think as we look at what potentially could be damaging is that IoT, that medical
mm,
device that takes us to the place that we have not been, but the place of patient safety, the place of where care is impacted. And I think those are things that concern us. And certainly as we are in an environment today where more and more healthcares are recognizing an increasing need for partners, it's not decreasing. And where we used to be standalone, today we see more of cloud, more of partnering, more of remote. And as we go into that environment, our ability to manage the third party and recognize the kind of impact that can occur when a third party is providing translation services or they're doing dictation, they're doing code translations for ICD-10 for us, and it suddenly stops the whole business if they're doing imaging services. So the partnering is a huge issue as we go forward.
yeah. Love it, Karl. Ed, what would you add?
Yeah, I think, wow, it's a hard question to answer. I think if we've learned anything over the last year with the pandemic is, anything is possible. And I know that there were some health systems that actually had in their risk matrix, they had a pandemic, listed
Yeah.
there, but it was, huge
Everyone
impact,
laughed at.
but low likelihood, right? And,
Yeah.
but the point is, you know, we weren't prepared from a supply chain perspective. And I think that's an area of focus. If you think about risk in sort of three large categories, you got the enterprise risk, you have your ecosystem risk, the third parties we talked about a lot during the call today, but then you have the systemic risk affecting your supply chain. And
Mm,
so if you think about, and I think health systems really need to do a good job of thinking through their supply chain, um, on a systemic basis. Where's there's opportunity to shut down, not just their health system or their clinic, but the entire ecosystem, right? That's where I think things get really interesting, especially when you think about things like new risks at the data level, like data integrity, the ability to go in and actually change data, not encrypt it, not make it unusable, not steal it, right? But actually change it, and change it maybe en masse in a way that may cause real patient harm,
mm,
right? So
Yeah.
I think those are areas we have to think through. What are the gray rhinos coming at us, right? What are those, what are those like the recent Microsoft Exchange issue, right? The SolarWinds issue, right? What's the next issue like that's going to, impact the industry like those two incidents did, right? I think those are coming, and I think we're going to get more gray rhinos. We're going to have more systemic, risks thrown at us, and I think as an industry, we have to get ahead of it. And the way to get ahead of it is really, leverage as much of the people, the process, the tools that are out there, the automation that's out there, to throw out those old assumptions, to throw out the old way we did things, get rid of the spreadsheets. I mean, enough of spreadsheets, right?
Yeah.
And really start to get ahead of it so we have more time to think. We're so focused on doing right now, we don't have enough time to think as an industry, and we need more time to think and process and really prepare ourselves for the next pandemic, because it will happen. It's just a matter of time. It's just a question of when.
Sure. Or even some other challenge. I think that's what's fascinating. And you both touched on it, and maybe harken back to McLaughlin Group. I don't know if you watched that old school show where
Yeah.
he says the right answer is an organization that doesn't assess risk properly, honestly, and effectively. I think that's the biggest risk, right?
Yeah.
And I think you
Do
both touched
nothing.
on it.
Do nothing, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the ones that
No,
are,
no.
as Carl said, that are using Google answers
Yeah.
rather than being
I,
honest with
I,
themselves.
I think 5 years ago that was more prevalent. I think today, people know they have to do something. They're just not
Yeah.
sure what to do or where to start.
That's
And I
fair.
think that's the thing that I think people, especially with the last year, people recognize the risks to PPE and to supply chain and to
Mhm.
care at a level that we never experienced, right? So
Yeah,
I think it
absolutely.
woke up a lot of people, and people now are scrambling to figure out, okay, IT had to work remote for a year, right? They had to do things that they didn't think about 12 months prior. And that really shook the system. So I think more and more that notion of do nothing, or that's gone. People have to do something, or the predecessor will do something, right?
Yeah,
And
that's fair.
so, yeah.
Great assessment. Well, Carl, Ed, this was a fun discussion, and I appreciate you sharing all these insights and perspectives. And thanks everyone for watching. If you want to find more great health IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Carl.